The investigator from the state licensing board sat across the institutional desk, pointed to a single line in a patient chart, and asked a simple question. Can you explain the specific clinical reasoning that led you to rule out immediate specialist referral for this patient? 11 seconds of silence followed. Dr. Allison Reyes, an optometrist with an 18-year spotless professional record, sat staring at her own signature. The patient in question had never been harmed. The exam had been performed correctly. The care was appropriate, and the medical outcome turned out fine. Yet, as the clock ticked in the sterile audit room, Dr. Reyes realized she could not answer the question. The record before her was beautiful, consistent, and medically coherent. It was also a document she had signed, but had not written. How does a veteran clinician, with thousands of successful cases, find her professional competence in question over a patient record that contains no medical errors? This is a case study of an independent practice in the coastal Southeast that automated its medical charting. The crisis that followed was not triggered by a clinical mistake. It was triggered by perfect execution of a technology that erased the boundary between human thought and machine-generated text. This is not a traditional horror story about a technical glitch. It is not a promotional video for an artificial intelligence startup. This is the messy truth of what happens when the language of clinical judgment is outsourced to an automated system. Our opening scorecard outlines a deployment where every operational metric reached a perfect score, while the defensive integrity of the practice was quietly compromised. By the end of this case study, we will look at the final ledger to see the single number that turned an immaculate chart into a professional trap. To understand the nature of this vulnerability, we must look at the practice from the outside in, beginning with the document that initiated the crisis. The investigation did not begin with an injury or a malpractice suit. It began with an unrelated administrative complaint over a billing double charge, which triggered a routine records audit by the Regional Licensing Board. An investigator pulled a random sample of 50 charts across a 6-month window. As the auditor scrolled through the files, a strange sense of unease began to develop. Every examination record was immaculate, containing beautifully structured narratives on macular health, optic nerve topography, and corneal integrity. The notes were free of the typos, fragments, and shorthand that define human medical charting. But they were also uncannily similar. Chart after chart used the same structural rhythms, the same transitional phrases, the same uniform clinical descriptions. Then the auditor paused on one chart in particular. The chart belonged to a 61-year-old patient named Arthur Pendleton, who presented with mild asymmetric intraocular pressure and a history of borderline glaucoma metrics. The record contained a specific piece of clinical judgment about the optic disc margins, describing them as stable relative to past baselines and deferring a specialist referral in favor of localized monitoring. The decision itself was medically reasonable, and subsequent visits proved the patient was stable. But the auditor noticed that the phrasing describing the optic disc margin was word for word the same as 3 other charts, from 3 unrelated patients. The investigator leaned forward and asked Dr. Reyes to reconstruct the visual observations that led her to that determination. Dr. Reyes looked at the text. She looked at the signature. The room stayed silent. To discover why an experienced doctor was left speechless by her own chart, we must step back into the clinic to observe exactly how these records were manufactured. Modern optometry generates an enormous amount of structured data. An autorefractor measures refractive error. An optical coherence tomography scanner captures cross-sectional images of the retina. Visual field analyzers map peripheral sensitivity. For nearly 2 decades, Dr. Reyes ran a successful practice, but the volume of that data was consuming her life. She spent up to 3 hours every evening typing summaries, copying numbers off diagnostic screens, and formatting insurance fields. To reclaim her personal life, she deployed a state-of-the-art AI documentation system called OptiScribe. The application was granted programmatic access to the clinic's equipment network and health records database. At the end of an exam, OptiScribe ingested the autorefractor output, the retinal scan maps, and the visual field matrices. Dr. Reyes would then speak a few shortened fragments into a microphone. Pressure 14 right, 16 left. Margins look clear. Follow-up 6 months. The early phase of the implementation was a massive triumph for the practice. The clinic reported that documentation overhead dropped dramatically. OptiScribe took the raw numerical data points and the brief spoken fragments and automatically generated a complete, standards-compliant, beautifully articulated clinical note. It passed a secondary insurance compliance audit with highest commendations. There was a standout moment in week 3. Dr. Rice examined a patient with complex hypertensive retinopathy and dictated just 4 words in the rush of the day. The system scanned the retinal photography, identified the vascular changes, and produced a clinical summary more descriptive and far cleaner than anything she could have typed by hand under pressure. But the software was operating on an interpolation model. It bridged the logical gaps between raw diagnostic data and brief human speech fragments, using highly plausible, professional language. The system did not invent findings that contradicted the data. It generated the most statistically probable clinical reasoning consistent with the available inputs. The result was accurate in this case, but accuracy was never guaranteed by the method. Because the text looked so flawless, Dr. Rice slipped into a cognitive tendency known as automation bias. She began skimming, checking the prescription lines, clicking sign. She stopped noticing where her own reasoning ended and the machine's language began. Returning to the audit table, the true consequence of this system architecture became clear. When the investigator asked Dr. Rice to explain the reasoning behind Arthur Pendleton's chart, she was trapped. Reading the note carefully for the first time, she realized she was looking at a ghost. It described observations of the optic disc margin in fluid advanced vocabulary she had never once used in 18 years of practice. The care plan was correct, but the documented path used to reach that conclusion was a product of the software's language model, not her mind. The system had looked at the stable scan, looked at her brief dictation fragment, and automatically generated a standard, highly defensible paragraph of medical prose to complete the record. Dr. Rice had signed the document, and in most jurisdictions, a clinical signature is an attestation. It is a claim that the record accurately reflects the care you provided and the judgment you personally exercise. The licensing board did not accuse Dr. Rice of harming a patient. They did not accuse her of malpractice. Instead, they raised a far more devastating procedural challenge. They questioned whether a comprehensive clinical evaluation had actually occurred at all, because the notes across 50 different charts used the exact same automated phrasing. The investigator expressed concern that the records were being mass-produced by a software template rather than reflecting individual human diagnostic thought. The consequences unraveled the practice without a single lawsuit ever being filed. The board initiated an expanded multi-year audit of her historical records. Her liability insurer, treating the unverifiable charts as a future risk, required an expensive mandatory remediation course. Worse, word of the documentation probe circulated among local medical networks. Referral relationships are built on confidence, and confidence is fragile. Ophthalmologists hesitant to refer into a practice under audit began sending their surgical cases to a competing clinic down the street. Her spotless reputation was damaged, and her clinic's revenue contracted sharply. This was a severe failure of explainability and provenance. The villain was not a broken technology. It was the quiet erasure of the visible line between a professional's reasoning and a machine's generated text. Dr. Rice managed to retain her clinical practice, but she overhauled her relationship with automated documentation. She stripped the system of its narrative autonomy, establishing a strict framework centered on provenance verification. Today, the software is blocked from generating any line of independent clinical interpretation. It can transcribe audio, format device metrics, and organize billing codes. But every diagnostic conclusion must be dictated by Dr. Rice in her own words before the system can save the file. Furthermore, every record generated in her clinic now carries explicit digital provenance markers. The charts cleanly separate data that was directly measured by hardware, data that was observed by the human eye, and text that was formatted by an assistant tool. The true redemption came in how she approached her charts. Dr. Rice began reading every word of her notes aloud before applying her signature, ensuring the evidence trail was an authentic reflection of her own mind. The ordeal of Dr. Allison Rice leaves every modern professional with 3 sharp, definitive lessons. First, when a machine writes in your voice, you lose the ability to prove you were ever thinking. A perfect chart becomes a suspicious one the moment it cannot be traced to a human mind. Second, a professional signature is an attestation, not a casual confirmation of agreement. You are accountable for every word, every adjective, and every generated sentence that sits above your name. Third, efficiency must never be bought by sacrificing the transparency of your reasoning. In the age of generated text, who authored a document matters more than how flawless it looks. The machine proposes, the human decides. If you want to protect your independent business and your professional reputation from the hidden vulnerabilities of this automated era, hit that subscribe button right now. In our next case study, we step into the fast-paced world of independent pharmacy, exploring a pharmacist whose AI drug interaction software never made a single error across 2 years of high-volume service, and why that flawless performance was the exact reason his business nearly collapsed.